Buon pomeriggio, sono Silvia Petrosillo di Macmillan Education Italy. Benvenuti al nostro webinar di oggi in cui ospiteremo Thom Kiddle, direttore dell'istituto NILE, il Norwich Institute for Language Education. NILE è un ente accreditato dal British Council e membro di Equals. NILE organizza corsi di formazione per docenti di lingua inglese, corsi online, quindi attraverso webinar, oppure face to face, nella sede inglese e anche in Italia su richiesta, su vari argomenti, a partire da certificazioni richieste dai docenti a argomenti più specifici e anche generici su richiesta. I corsi NILE, è anche bene ricordarlo, sono acquistabili tramite la carta docente. Per conoscere come iscriversi e come poter utilizzare la carta docente per acquistare un corso NILE e per conoscere anche gli sconti riservati ai docenti di lingua inglese, potete contattarmi direttamente al mio indirizzo email che vi sarà fornito alla fine del webinar. Questo pomeriggio Thom parlerà di Principles and Pitfalls in Language Assessment, un argomento molto importante. La valutazione è un argomento abbastanza molto richiesto a voi docenti di lingua inglese. Esploreremo quindi con Thom vari modi della valutazione. Thom inoltre ha anche conseguito un master proprio in language testing e ha una lunga esperienza di insegnamento di lingua inglese in varie parti del mondo. Come sempre vi ricordo alcune informazioni di servizio: riceverete l'attestato via email entro una settimana circa a partire da oggi, e inoltre durante il webinar potete redigere delle domande direttamente nello schermo in basso alla vostra destra, alle cui domande poi risponderà Thom alla fine appunto del webinar stesso. Le slide e il video della presentazione del webinar saranno disponibili sul sito mondadorieducation.it. Ringrazio Macmillan Education, naturalmente Mondadori Education, nonché NILE, per aver organizzato questo webinar. Buona visione a tutti. Thom, it is now over to you, and I'll speak you at the end of the questions and answer moment. Thank you.
Good afternoon everybody in Italy. Thank you very much to Silvia for the introduction, and thank you very much to Macmillan and to Mondadori for inviting me to speak to you here today from our base in Norwich. Silvia's given a very nice introduction to me and to what NILE does, and I'm going to be talking to you today about principles and pitfalls in language testing and assessment, which is very dear to my heart in my own professional career and also in what I do for NILE on a day-to-day basis. I'm talking to you now, and I hope you can see my my image. I've got some colours I thought would be appropriate for talking to Italian teachers. I hope you can see the green, red, and white in the background here. But I'm going to shift now to a presentation, which will be the basis of my talk to you today, and then I'll come back and join you face to face for some questions at the end. So, if this works, let me just. Yeah. Okay, hopefully you can see my presentation here on the screen. As we say, I'm going to be talking about principles and pitfalls, but let's start with some of your thoughts. Metaphors in testing and assessment. Just take a moment. Maybe you'd like to close your eyes or look up into the sky, look at the ceiling wherever you are, and think, for you, what is it like to make a test, to design an assessment? What is a metaphor in your life? What things do you do which make you feel that it encompasses the processes of designing a good test? Now, this is something maybe you've had thoughts coming into your mind about. Making a test is like preparing a meal, getting the ingredients right, getting the proportions right, getting the recipe right, so that when you present your test to the students or your meal to your guests, you have everything in balance and everything's right there for the way you want to engage the people you're cooking for or you're testing. Maybe your metaphor was more about Going on a shopping trip, getting everything that you need from the resources you have, and choosing and selecting things which you think are appropriate for the situation, that they're the right fits, that they're the right shape, and they achieve the outcome that you want to achieve. Maybe your metaphor was more like a construction metaphor, starting with the foundations and having a good blueprint, a plan for where you want to go, and slowly building up to the finished article. Or maybe for you, making a test is like going on a journey. You learn new things every step of the way. You decide new things. You take turns, to follow maps, follow your intuition, and at the end of the journey, you'll realize whether you would make the same journey again, or whether you would do different routes to get to a similar direction in the future. All of these are very valid metaphors for the process we go for when we think about designing a test, designing an assessment instrument for the learners we work with. But it's not easy. Let's start with stating some truth. It's not easy to design a good test, to understand all of the things that are involved in test design and production and delivery, and analyzing the results and sharing the results with students. And there are some very fundamental things which we need to make decisions about at the start of the process. As this is a webinar about testing and assessment, let me start off with a test question for you. Here's our test question. And the test question is, which tree is the biggest? Let's have a think about what your answer might be. Which tree is the biggest? Well, you may think that the tree on the left is the biggest because it covers the biggest area in space. It's the widest area that's covered. It's got perhaps the most leaves. It's the fullest there, the most branches. But you may have chosen the second image because this tree is the tallest. It's showing perhaps the progress going up the highest. It's reached the highest point. You may have thought that the third image is more representative of the biggest. It's got the biggest circumference, the biggest girth. It's the widest around the base. Or it may have been for you that the biggest is actually not just what we can see above the ground, but what goes down below the ground. All of these would be sensible answers to that question, which tree is the biggest? And obviously the right answer to this is it depends. It depends what we're looking for. It depends what we're looking at. It depends what we want to state about the tree, or if we further the analogy, it depends what we want to say about the proficiency of the learners we're offering to take this language test. We could, for example, count all the leaves and say that's representative of the number of words that a learner knows. Or we could look at the depth of the roots and say we can see what underlying skills, what underlying knowledge support their language proficiency. But it's even more difficult than that because language proficiency isn't as stable as a tree where we could measure the circumference or count the leaves on the branches or even measure the depths of the roots. Language proficiency doesn't stay in one place at one time. In fact, it's more like a swarm of bees. How on earth do we measure a swarm of bees? At some points they can be all clustered together and within a hive, and we could say, okay, they're all there, but in other times they're flying around the sky. And if we think about all of these bees representing different bits of language knowledge that a learner has, at what point can we do a cross-section, a testing moment that we can say, this is exactly how much space the language proficiency occupies, or how many things that a learner knows about language, or what they can do without language. So we need to acknowledge that we're dealing with a movable feast, with something that we have to make decisions about when we're going to do a cross-section, when we're going to decide exactly what and how we're going to measure this ability that a learner has. And we also need to face a couple of other things which are nicely encompassed in these two quotes from the literature. I like the first one very much because it serves to remind us that not everything that we can count with numbers actually counts in education. Can we ever say we can measure motivation? Can we say we can measure attitude? Can we say we can measure a feel for learning? Can we measure if someone has an ear for language? Can we actually state that all of these things are possible to count? And if we disagree with that, if we disagree that not everything that counts can be counted. What do? Are we restrained, constricted by only being able to talk about things that we can actually put numbers to? Or do we need to embrace the idea of describing what language might be like rather than putting numbers to it? Because the second quote shows that still in the area of language education, when we describe language proficiency, we're describing very complex phenomena. We're describing things that we still don't have the full theory of how a first language is learned and how a second language is learned, and which parts of the brain operationalize that knowledge to produce written speech, to produce written text, or to produce spoken language. And what we need to do as language testers and as teachers is try and describe this in a small number of words that are meaningful and understandable to all the different people who might be interested in our test results, the students themselves, the parents, the school, the educational authority, the country. On an international level, what do these words mean across contexts? So we have to accept and embrace the challenges that exist in our field, and particularly in the idea of what we can do as teachers, what we can do as test designers, what we can do as assessors to make this meaningful for the people we're talking to about our learners' proficiency. And there's another thing as well, which is a challenge, I think, for teachers, and it's the relationship between teaching, learning, and assessment. And testing, of course, is a part of assessment. And to illustrate this, I want to introduce you to my son. Hopefully you can see my son there. This is Luke, or Luca to you, aged 2.5. And he's going to be, in this short video I'm going to show you, he's going to be undergoing a learning experience. And I'm going to ask you to watch the video. It's only less than a minute long, but I want you to look at the learning experience that he undergoes here. I want you to try and do 3 things. The first thing I'd like to do is to identify the target language. What part of the language is he learning at this moment? The second thing I want you to do is to look at it from pedagogical terms. Are there any principles of good teaching and learning that you can see in this short video? Are there any things that make us feel confident that this is a positive learning experience, one that will result in a successful learning outcome? And the third thing to do is to tell me, or to think for yourself, what point does teaching become testing? At what point is the learning process moving into an assessment process, a moment at which he's tested on the knowledge he's learned? Okay, so those are the 3 things. What's the target language? What are the principles of good teaching and learning which you see in his experience? And at what point does teaching turn into testing? Okay, so I'm going to play the video now, and I'm just going to enable the sound.
The yellow one. Get a green one, Lukey. A green one. Can you find a green one? Look, here. Here's a green one. Oh, that's the yellow one. Can you get a green one now? Yeah, good boy. Another green one. That's good. And a yellow one. Now a yellow one. A yellow one? No, that's a green one. A yellow one. The other colour. There's the other colour. There, yellow one. Good. What colour's that, Lukey?
Okay, I'm back with you now. Hopefully you heard the video and were able to see his process there. So I've asked you to think about 3 questions. The first question was, what was the target language? What was he being taught in that learning experience? And you may have come up with the answer colours, but more specifically, it was targeted on just 2 colours. It was targeted on green and yellow. So that was what he was trying to learn, and that was the learning aim of that experience. Although it wasn't a classroom-based experience, were there still principles of good pedagogy, good teaching and learning that we might have seen in that video? Some of the things you might have thought of were learning by doing, tactile, kinesthetic activities that he was able to not just use his brain, but use his body to respond to the input he was getting into his own practice. You may also have thought about the chance for repetition. that he didn't just get one chance to do it, he was doing the same thing again and again. You may have also noted the praise that was given, lots of encouragement from the teacher, lots of support. You may have noticed that he was free to make errors. There was no judgment there. There was just encouragement and support and gentle corrective advice, so he could proceed to the next stage and process things for himself. You may also have thought that it was well supported in terms of having an outcome that he could see, that it was very tangible, that there was a reason for doing it, and it was activity-based, task-based, if you like, in what he was trying to achieve there. All of these things we'd probably say in a classroom setting or in any learning situation were positive, student-centered, task-based, lots of praise, encouragement, room to make errors, whole body learning, physical response, kinesthetic, tactile, all of these things were positive in that learning experience. And the third question I asked you was, what point did the teaching turn to testing? So he was asked there right at the end, what colour's that one, Luki? That was the moment at which all of the tower was full of these green and yellow quoits, and he was asked, what colour's that one? For the last one he was going to put on top of the pile. Now, bearing in mind that this is my son, be gentle. Do you think there's going to be a successful learning outcome from this? From that learning experience that we agreed had lots of positive features, is he going to get the test question right? Well, presumably he's only got a 50-50 chance. You can say for yourself now, do you think he's going to get it right? And we'll have a look. We'll play the last couple of seconds of the video again and hear his answer to the testing question.
What colour is that, Luki? Red.
Isn't learning and teaching wonderful? This is why teachers are fearful of testing and assessment. Hopefully you heard there that after all that positive learning, all of that input, all of that self-directed learning, all of that support, his answer to the question, what colour's that one, was red. Where did that come from? And that speaks so much to us as teachers. Where is it that all of that input goes? What is it that makes a difference to a learner? Because clearly it hadn't made a difference to him, despite the fact that we said, yeah, it's a very achievable task, yellow and green. We had all this input, and he comes out with red at the end there. And there's a number of interesting things that are going on there. One thing we might say is that as teachers, we can't control how acquisition happens. We can enable the conditions for it, but we can't be certain that the input we give is going to turn into intake and then to be ready for output just when we as teachers want it to happen. So we have to acknowledge that for some learners, they may learn very fast and very linearly. For other learners, it may take time for that language input to process, to be ready to be produced. And we know that receptive knowledge precedes productive knowledge, so we may not get there at the right time when the test appears. There's also something else going on that's very interesting, I think, because if you think about the questions I asked you, what was the target language? And we said that the target language was yellow and green. But then if we think about the test question he was asked, the test question was, what color is that one? So actually, that's not a very fair test question, is it? We've taught him yellow and green, yellow and green, yellow and green. But when we've come to the test, we've actually asked him not just, do you know the difference between yellow and green, but do you know that yellow and green are part of a set that we call colors? And color is the overarching category, and yellow and green are two of the words within that category. So we've asked a question which is much more cognitively demanding than the learning we've given him. In fact, the way we've tested him has tripped him up completely. And it may be that if we'd asked the test question, is that yellow or green, he'd have stood a much better chance of showing his learning than a question which works on an abstract level, what color is that one? So we have to be really careful that the tests we make, the tests we design, the instruments that we have to check learning progress and to check learning achievement are actually fair and valid representations of the teaching that's gone into them. Now, I told my son, who's much older now, that I was going to be using this video to talk to teachers in Italy, and he said, "Oh no, Dad, everyone in Italy will think I'm stupid and can't speak the language." So he asked me to make another video just to show that he was capable of doing that now. So here is Luke aged 7.
This is yellow. This is green. And this is red.
And he was very keen that I shared that with you so that you knew that he had achieved the learning outcome now, 5 years later. And there's another interesting point about that, isn't there? Another interesting point that they'll get there eventually. They'll learn at their own pace. When they're ready, the language, if we've given them enough input and enough support, the language will be there as part of their store. But that's not much good to us as testers, because we're not really interested in general progress and acquisition and internalization of language. We're interested in mastery. We're interested in when we can see that language coming out so we can measure it. So it gives us a challenge to kind of to put all these square pegs into round holes, to match what we know about language acquisition and the learning process with what we can do in terms of strong principles for the testing process. And that's why I'd like to talk to you about principles today. We've seen some of the pitfalls, and we'll look at other pitfalls as we go along. But I want to link this to kind of 4 cornerstones, 4 key principles of testing and assessment, which are worth considering when we're talking about designing a test, giving a test, responding to a test, and feeding back on a test. And the first one of those is something which is really fundamental to all test design, and it's the concept of validity. And validity asks us to answer a very straightforward question at its heart. And that question is exemplified by this this still from a TV advert that was shown in the UK for many years. To what extent does the test measure what we claim it measures? If we take the example of my son there, was that a test of yellow and green, or was it actually a secret test of the abstract concept of colours? So to what extent does our test do what it claims to measure? This advert asked, if something does what it says on the tin, what you see on the outside is what you get on the inside. So the first thing we have to bear in mind, and this is a kind of subjective opinion of the test designer, but also the test takers, does the test measure what it claims to be measuring? This is the underpinning root of all arguments and defenses of validity. And they can be very important in some of our contexts, what we call high stakes testing. We may have to defend those judgments. We may be in a situation where students claim that it wasn't an accurate measurement of what the test claimed to measure, or more importantly, what the test results are being used to say about the learner. We need to remember that validity is not about the test in itself, but about what the results are used for. So we may have the most perfect placement test, but if we use it 3 months later to measure the achievement of learners on a particular course of learning, it'll no longer be valid for the purpose we're putting it to. So really, does the test do what we claim it does? And are the results and what we say about the students' learning supported by the activities we've asked them to do in the testing process? We can think very clearly. An example of this might be if we're testing speaking, and if we try and base some of the speaking activities on their knowledge of the phonemic script, does that have any justification of a test measuring what it claims to measure, or is that actually testing a very different skill or part of the speaking skill? And this leads us to the question of authenticity. Authenticity about to what extent can we replicate the kind of activities that learners will do in real life settings, whether those be real academic settings or real social settings or real professional settings. To what extent can we replicate the kind of activities they'll do in real life settings with the kind of activities we can set them in a testing situation? Now, I don't know how it works in Italy, but in the UK, when your car is over 3 years old, they ask you to take it once a year to a garage to have an MOT, which is a Ministry of Transport test. And the purpose of that test is to say whether the car is still able to be driven on the roads safely. And it does things like it measures the brakes. Now, the most authentic way, the real life way of measuring how good the brakes on my car are for the mechanic from the garage to get into my car and to drive around the town, and every time the car needs to brake at a red light or in a queue of traffic, to put on the brakes, and if the mechanic doesn't crash into the car in front, then that will be a good test, an authentic test of how the brakes need to operate. And he should probably do that in dry weather and in wet weather and in icy weather, all sorts of weathers, to give a broad picture of the car's performance under different conditions. Wonderful. I don't want to give the mechanic my car for that long, and I don't think the mechanic wants to be put in that situation. So we have to get to some kind of operational authenticity from the tasks we set. In the car example, they put it on a machine which generates the speed from the road and then check if the car's brakes are holding up. So in a sense, every testing situation is by nature slightly inauthentic, because we're unable to follow the learners through their real life progress. But we do want to try to get as close as possible to the operations that we ask a learner to perform in their head and verbally or in writing, to the same kind of operations that they'll do inside their head and with their hand or the keyboard or their mouth when they're in the test situation. So we need to remember the authenticity principle as part of the tests we design as well. And of course, we need to remember fairness. A key part of validity is the idea of fairness for the candidates who are taking it. Now, this is possibly the most famous cartoon in language teaching and testing. I'm sure many of you will have seen this cartoon before. The idea there that for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. The exam must be the same for everybody, because that's the only way to assure fairness. And we can see what's trying to be represented here is something fundamentally unfair, because all of the candidates of this exam have different properties which can't all be measured by that same tree climbing test. There's a couple of points to remember about this. The first one is that we may have testing situations in which specific skills are necessary that not everybody has. If we're designing a test for air traffic controllers or English in business contexts, then we can't expect that to be a fair test that young learners could take. We have different cognitive demands on it. If we have a test of English for academic purposes, then we need a certain level of higher order thinking skills in all those candidates to be able to take it. But of course, we need to make sure that the test doesn't unfairly bias against protected characteristics such as gender or background or cultural knowledge. So we need to make sure that it's not unfairly weighted in favor of any particular person other than that person who has the skills that actually we're trying to measure. So we've got three principles within validity there. The idea of to what extent do the results measure what we claim they are measure and what we're going to tell other people that those test results measure. To what extent have we considered the authenticity of the actions, activities, operations that the learners have had to do in the test and what they will have to do in real life settings? And to what extent have we tried to eliminate any area of bias or discrimination that's not directly tapping the skills that the test claims to measure? So those are our kind of underlying principles of validity. The second cornerstone that we want to be looking at in terms of our test principles is directly related to validity, but it's the concept of reliability. And reliability really asks the question, does this test measure consistently? If I gave it to the same learners on a different day, if their knowledge and skills were the same, would their test results be the same? Many of you may have a variation on the bathroom scales in your houses. You know that you trust, or you hope you can trust, that when you get on the scales last thing at night and you get on the scales first thing in the morning, there won't be dramatically different results unless you're prone to an enormous midnight feast that you can see what the change in weight might be down to. But we expect that the instrument that we use will measure consistently over time if nothing else has changed. And that for us might mean that we need the test items to be measuring a similar thing within a test and not be too random. It might be that we need to check that the answer key is right, that we can't have different markers giving different points to different answers, or one marker giving a mark and another marker deciding that doesn't get the mark. So it might be about our marking key needs to be very consistent. And more often, for us as markers, particularly when we talk about marking the productive skills, the marking of speaking and writing tests, we need to think about scales and how we're interpreting the scales. And I've got another cartoon for you here, just to allow you to read through very briefly for yourself. So we can see that the man in this cartoon has suggested the idea of a scale of measurement, and for him, he's decided she's an 8 out of 10. That's some scale that he's assuming is shared with her. But then she comes back with this response, "You're a 10," which gives him pause for thought, because he doesn't think of himself as a 10 out of 10 in any sense. And he's asking this question, are we using the same scale? Are we actually talking about the same measurement instrument? And she comes back with a very witty response. 10 is the number of seconds it would take to replace you, not you're a 10 out of 10 on handsomeness or desirability or future partner status. And so it's a very clear idea that, of course, two markers assessing the same group of testees need to be using physically the same scale. But what is it about a marking scale that we internalize without realizing it? What is it about a set of marking criteria that makes us confident that the other people who are also marking those test papers or those students in a speaking test feel the same, particularly when we have scales which based on descriptors like a satisfactory level of pronunciation, or sometimes makes grammatical errors, or makes minor vocabulary slips. How do we know that my conception of satisfactory or sometimes or minor is the same as your conception of that? I may have much stricter principles in my own head about what grammatical correctness means in language performance, and therefore for me sometimes making grammatical mistakes might be far fewer in number than for you, who are more lenient and more communicative oriented. So we need to be sure that when we're marking reliably, either ourselves on a Monday morning with ourselves on a Friday afternoon, or ourselves as teachers in a group of markers who are all trying to give the same results for the same levels of performance on a larger scale, whether that's a class scale or a school scale or a national scale, that we're all having the same conception of what the statements about student performance mean in relation to a marking scale and the scores that we give them. So we've got this idea of we need to be reliable in the measurement, even if that's about the questions, and the questions have a marking key that's a right or wrong or 1 point or 2 points, but also in the marking on a productive level where we're making subjective judgments, when we're using expert judgment, teacher judgment, rater judgment. Are we using the same scales, and do we understand those scales in the same way? And then we have the complicated issue of how broad is our measurement. You may be familiar with this this folk tale, which I believe originally comes from India, which is about the blind men and describing what an elephant is. And the story goes that 5 blind men were asked to answer the question, "What is an elephant?" And so the first person touched the trunk of the elephant, and it said, "Oh, the elephant is like a snake, but thicker and a bit harder to the touch." And the other one touched the elephant's leg and said, "Well, no, an elephant is like a tree. It's solid and firm and unmovable on the ground." And another man touched the elephant's ear and said, "No, actually, it's like a sheet, like a leathery sheet, and it flaps and folds, and you can move it." Another one touches the skin and said, "Well, it's like the wall of a house. It's like a big solid block." And the final one touches the tail and he says, "No, for me, it's like a whip that's movable and moves around without you being able to touch it." And of course, they were all touching the same animal, but none of them had the bigger picture. And so how can we be confident when we're marking reliably that we've covered enough of the learner's language to make a solid, reliable judgment on that? Have we sampled so narrowly of what they can do that actually it's not representative of what they might do in other situations, and somebody else sampling another small part of that ability has got a completely different result because they haven't looked at the bigger picture? And so that might easily relate to something like a speaking exam, whereas if we say, okay, I'm going to get the students to write a postcard, and on that basis I'm going to judge their writing proficiency. Well, okay if the results we're reporting are about postcard writing, but if the results we're reporting are about language written performance generally, then the ability to write a postcard, in authenticity terms, perhaps an older and slightly outdated skill in the advent of digital communication, is that giving us enough of a picture of the written performance skill to make us feel confident that that another person who did a similar writing task in another genre would get a similar score. So we have to be careful that we have the breadth in reliability as well, and that's particularly important for teachers when we're looking at learners all through the term. Do we base our judgment just on a single written multiple choice test, or do we draw in other aspects where we can measure their performance in tasks, their performance with other peers in the class, their performance on listening and reading and speaking, as well as the grammatical and vocabulary parts that we can test easily. So we've got this idea of reliability as well. So we'll move on now from reliability, that's our second cornerstone, to our third cornerstone, which is all about practicality. Practicality asks us to have the consideration. Well, it's all very well considering reliability and validity and making the most beautiful test for the purpose that we can, and thinking this is the ideal test situation, and look at my test, isn't it perfect? Don't all my questions match, and aren't they all addressing the same idea, and aren't they well written, and isn't the answer key well developed, and isn't my scale brilliant, just like this car? But if we're in reality realize that our settings for driving this car look a bit like this, then we're in a tricky situation. We have to make sure that the test design and the activities we make the learners do and the way we try to measure those activities are actually realistic for the context we're putting that in. If, for example, we design a test that's dependent on an internet connection or having access to a computer, is that internet connectivity stable? Will all learners be able to operate that in the same way? Are they familiar with the keyboard, or have they jumped over the keyboards and are now into touchscreen technology rather than being able to type fast on a keyboard? If we're asking for a speaking assessment that's actually assessed by 2 teachers rather than 1, and neither of those teachers are the classroom teacher because they don't want to prejudice their judgment. Is it possible? Is it financially possible to get 2 teachers per student? Is it possible to train those raters in advance? Have we got time to do the standardization training? If we're designing a listening test and we want to use colored pictures, is it possible that we can actually produce enough test papers which have color rather than a black and white photocopier? I was doing testing situation in Nepal, in the base of the Himalayas, and the practicality concerns for the test we were designing were so severe, so strict in terms of the test being written in the capital city and then being taken by road and by bumpy roads, particular points, and then tests loaded onto a donkey, which were taken. The donkey was led to test centers which were away from the nearest road, in some cases a day or 2 days away from the nearest road. How do we ensure practicality of those tests? How do we ensure that the test center at the end of this test journey is able to deliver the tests that we conceptualized back in our infrastructure enabled setting in the capital city? So practicality in those terms is a key consideration, and practicality also in technological terms is a key consideration. Now, when I started teaching back in 1997, technology for me in teaching basically meant these 2 things, perhaps familiar to those of you who have been teaching for as long as I have and longer: a cassette recorder and an overhead projector. If you were very lucky and worked in a very well-resourced school, you may have had one of these. Not a slide projector, but an electronic pencil sharpener. This was the height of technology when I started teaching. However, in today's world, it gets a little bit overwhelming, doesn't it? The amount of technology that's potentially at our students and our teachers' fingertips. To what extent should these be part of the learning process? To what extent should these be part of the testing process? What are the potential pitfalls if we try to embrace the way in which learners use language in today's world in the ways in which we test them in a classroom setting or a school setting? For example, we look at the testing technology from 1935. This was a test machine that used to read multiple choice cards and gave an output in terms of technology. But today we have all sorts of mobile-based opportunities. We have mobile testing like the Socrative platform. We have tests that can be based around videos with questions appearing at different parts of a video, like in the Ed Puzzle. We have the bottom of the screen there, which is something called VoiceThread, where you can do peer assessment by uploading a piece of content and having all the learners comment on that, either by they're using their voice, uploading a voice file, typing in their answer. All of these potential opportunities with technology, which allow us to assess in very different ways from a pen and paper on a desk. But then there's also the question of the pitfalls of that. What is it that technology might enable students to game the test, to cheat the system, to have microphones and speakers connecting them to the outside world in a very high stakes test? There's fascinating stories from other testing contexts where a strict invigilator came into the test room and said, okay, everybody roll up your sleeves, all bags, anything electronic must stay outside the room. And the parents of the kids in this test attacked the test building, said it's not fair. Everybody cheats in this test. If our students aren't allowed to cheat, then it's unfair for them not to be able to use the same devices, the same opportunities, which is kind of a crazy Kafkaesque way to look at the world of testing. But when tests are so important, so high stakes, then learners will bring anything at their disposal to help them get an advantage there. And the image at the bottom of the screen, this idea of to what extent is automated marking of tests going to be part of our future? Not just a computer program that can mark a multiple choice test, but a computer program that can mark a student's speech or a student's extended writing. And to what extent do we trust that the practicalities involved in giving the responsibility of testing over to a computer rather than to a human will be valid and reliable as well? And what do we do if we don't have the resources to support that in our own local contexts? So all of these factors are important when we consider practicality. And the final area, the fourth cornerstone that I want to talk about, is the area of impact. Impact asks us to consider what's the bigger effect that this test will have on the educational and perhaps socio-educational environment. It's like this idea of standardization, this little cartoon I very much like. I became a teacher that I could help kids pass the standardized tests. Said no teacher ever. We don't want the impact of a test to drive teaching to boring preparation of past papers, to look at the best way to answer multiple choice questions. This should not be what tests drive teaching and learning towards. We have to be careful of the impact of the choices we make in test design so that they don't force the classroom teaching and the learners learning into things that aren't embracing the whole aspect of learning on the human, the communicative, the interpersonal dimensions of language use. It's not very common to walk into a natural language setting and be asked a multiple choice question. We need to think whether our tests are having an impact in the way that we're comfortable with on the teaching and learning that precedes it. We also need to be aware of the impact in the wider world, the idea of what reference points there are out there. Perhaps the biggest publication or the publication which has had the biggest impact in the last 20 years of our field, language teaching, learning and assessment, is the Common European Framework of Reference, the famous Blue Book, which describes levels of performance at those A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2 levels that I'm sure you're very familiar with. It's very rare now to find a course book or a test which doesn't claim to be aligned to the Common European Framework of Reference. And it's a very useful resource. And the new companion volume, which came out in November last year, is in addition to that, it gives us a huge set of resources of teachers. But it's not the only way of looking at language, and it doesn't confer good test status on a test just because it claims to reference those Common European Framework levels. It's a bit like this still from a Disney picture. I'm sure you recognize this. In this moment in a film is Cinderella. I'm sure it's gone straight through your mind. At this particular moment, Prince Charming, or one of Prince Charming's assistants, is fitting the glass slipper on Cinderella's foot. Now, I don't know how many of you are married or in long-term relationships, but I'm willing to bet that a very small percentage of you chose your future partner based on their shoe size. Now, if we try and fit everything we know about language learning and language teaching into very small frameworks, very small boxes, without embracing everything else that's important to us in our language learning situation, we may be guilty of doing this, that saying, oh, well, because it's aligned to the CEFR and it says A2 or B1 on it, then it's a good test. We need to consider what else we might be interested in when we're measuring a learner's proficiency. Particularly, we need to bear in mind that CEFR levels aren't plateaus. They aren't points at which a learner goes through a B1 course, gets to the end of it, goes to sleep that night, and wakes up the next morning and is automatically B2. It doesn't work like that. It's not as constrained as that. It's not a framework which is about huge steps up and plateaus. It's a little bit more like a rainbow. And that spectrum of color. Can we say exactly where red stops and orange starts? Can we say where orange stops and yellow starts? Of course we can't. But we have to make decisions as test developers. Where are we going to say the cut scores are, and how comfortable do we feel that this is a good marker of progress? So we need to be aware of the impact our test has on the teaching and learning, and also the impact that other resources have on what we do in our test development. We have to be aware also of the great opportunities in self-assessment. How much of a principle in our language testing and assessment can be asking the learners what they think about their progress? How much can we encourage a good learning atmosphere and a relationship between our tests and our learning, which is reflected in trusting the learners and having them mark their own progress and having them be aware of their goals and achieving those goals, which we would like as a kind of holistic approach. And this is the area of learning-oriented assessment, which I'm very interested in at the moment, the extent to which we can empower learners to take responsibility for the learning process and see assessment and testing as markers for themselves of stages on that journey and as informative to themselves, feedback that helps them improve, not just gives them a numerical score or a result which is either empowering or frustrating. So my metaphor, and the one that I'd like to leave you with, is that our responsibility in test design is to be aware of all these pitfalls, but hold the principles to in our minds like supporters of a bridge. And our job is to make a bridge between good teaching and learning on one side and good testing and assessments on the other side, which enables us to feel confident that our learners can go on a journey with us, that when we measure their progress, that's useful to them, and we feel confident that we're stating results based on that are meaningful, useful, and valid. So that's what I wanted to tell you about in terms of my views on principles and pitfalls in language testing and assessment. I hope it's been useful. I come, as Sylvia said at the beginning, from an organisation called NILE, Norwich Institute for Language Education, and we're based in Norwich, a beautiful city on the east coast of England, and we were awarded this year the accolade of top teacher training centre in the UK based on our British Council inspections. And we run all sorts of programmes throughout the year, face-to-face in Norwich, overseas and online, programmes like Learning Differences and Inclusion, how to develop your language and understand methodology, how to teach English for academic purposes, how to work with technology in teaching and learning, how to manage language education institutions, and my own course, Principles of Testing, Evaluation and Assessment. So I hope you've taken something away from that and it's been useful food for thought. If you want any more information about NILE or the work we do, please do contact Sylvia at Macmillan. And I'm now going to come back to you face to face and have a look at some of your questions for the last 10 minutes. So I think if I do this correctly, I will be back with you. Hopefully you can see me there. Okay. Okay, there's some lovely questions which I've got now in front of me, and I'm going to address a few of those for the next few minutes. One of the questions which is very interesting is, what would you suggest to teachers when they realise that a test was not really effective? We've got a number of choices there. The first ones are kind of easy for me to say, and those are, well, what lessons can we learn for the next time that we're writing a test or designing assessment instruments for our learners? So on a very basic level, each test we design needs to build on the lessons learned from the past one. There's a lovely quote, I think, from Nelson Mandela, which says, "I never lose. I either win or I learn." So no, we're not always going to be perfect in our test design. We need to be aware that every test is a compromise, but we need to make sure that if we're not comfortable with the effectiveness of the test, then we learn from that experience so the next one's better. However, that doesn't really help the students who took that test. So then we've got two choices. We can either make some decisions before we give the results to students, so we can make some decisions based on which of the test items were not working well, which of the test items proved to be impossible to answer or perhaps had the wrong answer key. There are statistical procedures we can do there to find out how difficult a test item was and how effective a test item was in relation to whether the stronger students in the test as a whole got that question right, or if the stronger students on the test as a whole got a particular question wrong, then that's obviously a question that's not working in the way we planned it to work. So if we have the opportunity to go back to the test and look at the test results based on the information we have from the students taking the test before we give the results to the students, then we can have grade reviews, and we might want to adjust the cut scores on a particular test based on what we know about the results within there. The other option, if we are in a situation where we have to give the results back immediately, or the students have already seen the results of their test, is to take that learning experience and turn it into a classroom learning experience and talk to the learners about the strengths and the weaknesses and where they see that as being part of their own learning process. What did they find difficult about a particular test? What did they think would have made a more effective test? What do they think would have been a fairer measurement of their abilities? And we can put that into a kind of a learning space for both us as the test designers and the learners to think about what assessment really means. And if their feeling of not effective was not fair, then it is worth exploring those ideas about what fairness in assessment and a representative sample of their assessment might be in the future. I'll give you an example from my own experience. I did a study for my master's, which was about students taking a speaking test in front of a human rater, or taking the same speaking test but giving their answer to a computer via a microphone like I have on now. And so I set up a situation where students, all the students had the opportunity to perform a speaking test with an examiner and to do a very similar version in front of a computer and giving their response into through a microphone onto the computer. In both situations, the test was marked by a human. We weren't going for fully automated computer mark testing, but the delivery of the answer was either face-to-face with a human or on a computer. And I was trying to decide whether actually in the world, that was 2010, in that world, whether learners were ready for computer-based assessment. And interestingly, the results that they got in terms of scores were almost identical. So someone who scored high on the face-to-face also scored high on the computer delivery. However, that's just one part of it. And I also asked the question to the candidates, to what extent do you feel that each test allowed you to give a fair representation of your speaking ability? and 90% of those people who took the test said they felt they'd been able to give a more representative sample of their speaking proficiency in the face-to-face context than in the computer-based context. So we do have to balance that idea of what effectiveness might mean in terms of student perceptions, and take into account that their own perceptions of effectiveness weren't actually backed up by the results that they got. They were based up by their inherent feelings about their comfort of speaking into a microphone rather than to a person. Another question here is if a standard test is better than a teacher design test because it's got more test design principles, and the teacher's own plan test may be hazardous because they may not have the training and the experience in test design. And I think it is an expression we use in England is horses for courses. We do need to be aware of the impact of the testing decisions we make. And I would very much argue strongly for classroom-based assessment, teacher-generated assessments to have its place in progress testing and achievement testing, and to allow the teacher's own voice and the teacher's own opinions to come through in those types of testing. But when we need to make high-stakes decisions which affect students' lives, then it may be safer to resort to proficiency tests that we know have gone through a full test development process. But I would say that even at the very local level, teachers should not be developing tests themselves. It's important to have test design teams, even a buddy system where you can check each other's tests. It's amazing when you're a test writer and you're also the test deliverer, how much you assume about the right answer to a test being clear because of you, when you're writing that item, know what the right answer is. It's very informative, just on a very basic level, to give that question to a colleague, someone you know has the skills beyond what the test is measuring, and see if they get the right answer. Don't give them the question and tell them what the right answer is. Give them the questions and see if they get the right answers, just to have that double check of whether your interpretations as the test writer are also shared by a test taker. And that can be very, very valid. Another question is like the difference here between assessment, testing, evaluation, measurement. For me, assessment is the broader overarching category. Part of assessment certainly is testing, and tests generally have a start point and an end point. They're an event in a student's life, and they can happen at various points within a course or within a program, but they'll have a fixed start point and a fixed end point. Assessment is a much more overarching category, and we know as teachers that we start assessing from the moment we walk into the class. We might be assessing attitude and behavior as well as language proficiency in everything we do informally, but every decision that we make about whether we're ready to move on, whether the learners have got something, whether they need more revision, is based on our assessment as teachers. And we need to remember that, and we need to value what a teacher can bring to that. Many of the large testing organizations, and indeed the very formation and principles behind the Common European Framework, are based on trusting teachers' knowledge of what student performance is. And so we do need, I think, to embrace other aspects of assessment, which might be a portfolio approach to assessment, using peer assessment, using self-assessment, using other aspects of productive assessment, or task-based assessment, or project-based assessment, to get that bigger picture, so that we're confident that we're not just only testing a very narrow part of the students' their own spectrum on the proficiency. I've run out of time. I've been talking one of my favorite topics, and I tend to run on, but I hope that's been useful for all of you out there. I'd love to speak to you again, and I wish you best of luck with your teaching and your testing. Over to Sylvia. Thank you, Tom.
It was great and very interesting. Thank you. I'm pretty sure all teachers appreciate, all this webinar about this important, tricky topic for Italian teachers, which is evaluation and test and assessment, as you may know. So thanks again, and if you need, you teachers, need to get in touch to know further information regarding NILE courses, just get in touch with me by sending me an email. And the slides and the video will be uploaded on the Mondadori education website in a couple of days. So thanks again, Tom. Hope you enjoyed it, and
thank you very much.
See you next time then. Thanks a lot.
Bye bye, everybody.
Arrivederci a tutti, grazie.